I never thought my snowplow would turn me into the most hated man in Riverside Meadows. But here we are, watching my driveway fill with news vans while Karen Pritchard from the HOA screams at a reporter about how I'm a menace to society. My name is Xavier Ingram, and I've lived in this suburban development outside of Columbus, Ohio, for the past 5 years. I run a small landscaping and property maintenance business, which means I own a truck with a plow attachment that I use during winter months to make extra cash. The setup has been perfect for me. A single guy in his mid-30s who likes the independence of working for himself and the flexibility to take on whatever jobs I want. My house is a modest 3-bedroom ranch at the end of Willow Court, backing up to a small wooded area that gives me some privacy from the dozen other cookie-cutter homes on my street. The trouble started in early January, right after a massive winter storm dumped 18 inches of snow across central Ohio. I'd spent 3 days straight plowing parking lots, driveways, and commercial properties, making enough money to cover my mortgage for 2 months. I was exhausted, covered in road salt and diesel fumes, and looking forward to a hot shower and maybe 12 hours of uninterrupted sleep when I pulled into my freshly plowed driveway at 6 in the morning. I barely had my boots off when someone knocked on my door. Through the frosted glass, I could see the unmistakable silhouette of Karen Pritchard, the HOA president, standing on my porch with her arms crossed. Karen was exactly what you'd picture when someone says, HOA president. A woman in her late 40s with an asymmetrical blonde haircut that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill, designer athleisure where that she definitely didn't exercise in, and a permanent expression like she just smelled something offensive. I opened the door, already knowing this wasn't going to be good. Karen, it's 6 in the morning. I'm aware of the time, Xavier, she said, not waiting for an invitation before stepping into my entryway. I've been up since 4 waiting for you to get home. We need to talk about community responsibility. I rubbed my eyes, trying to process what was happening. Can this wait until I've had some sleep? I've been working for 3 days straight. This won't take long, she said, pulling out her phone and scrolling through what looked like a list. As you know, our HOA bylaws state that homeowners are expected to contribute to the community welfare. Several of our board members, including myself, Deborah Chen, and Patricia Donovan, have driveways that need to be plowed. Since you have the equipment and the expertise, it only makes sense that you handle this for us. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that didn't come. You want me to plow your driveways? Exactly. I'm glad we're on the same page. She smiled like she'd just done me a favor. Deborah's driveway is the priority since she has that steep incline. Then Patricia's, then mine. If you have time after that, Brenda Mitchell on Oakwood Lane could also use your services. And you're planning to pay my regular rate? I asked, already knowing the answer. Karen's smile faltered slightly. Pay. Xavier, this is about community contribution. You have the equipment right there, she gestured toward my truck in the driveway, and it would barely take you an hour. Consider it your civic duty as a member of Riverside Meadows. I felt that special kind of anger that comes with complete exhaustion. Karen, I just worked 72 hours straight. I have paying customers. I'm not plowing anyone's driveway for free. Her expression hardened. I see. So you're refusing to help your neighbors in their time of need. That's very disappointing, Xavier. The HOA board will be hearing about this. The HOA board can hire me at my standard rate of $150 per driveway, I said. Otherwise, they can call one of the dozen other plow services in Columbus. Karen's face flushed red. $150. That's highway robbery. You're taking advantage of people during an emergency. That's the market rate, Karen. Actually, after a storm this big, most services are charging double. I'm being generous. She jabbed a finger toward my chest. You know what? Fine. Don't help. But don't come crying to the HOA when we start enforcing bylaws more strictly around here. I'm sure your truck parked in the driveway overnight violates some regulation. And those landscaping supplies you keep on the side of your house. Probably not up to code either. I closed my eyes and counted to 5, reminding myself that getting arrested for throttling an HOA president wasn't worth it. Get out of my house, Karen. She huffed and marched out, making sure to slam the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Through the glass, I watched her stomp back to her silver Lexus SUV, already on her phone with someone. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I managed to get about 4 hours of sleep before my phone started buzzing with texts. The first was from my neighbor, Tom Richardson, a retired accountant who lived 2 doors down. Heads up, Karen's on the warpath. She's telling everyone you refuse to help elderly homeowners during a crisis. The next was from my friend Mike Cordero, who lived on the opposite end of the development. Dude, what did you do to Karen? She's posting in the Facebook group about selfish community members who don't understand the meaning of neighborly cooperation. I groaned and opened the Riverside Meadows homeowners Facebook group, a digital hellscape I usually avoided. Sure enough, Karen had posted a long screed about unnamed community members who possessed the means to help during winter emergencies, but chose profit over people. The comments were already piling up, mostly from other busybodies agreeing with her, though a few people pointed out that expecting free professional services was unreasonable. I typed out a response. If anyone needs plowing services, I'm happy to provide them at standard rates. Running a business means I can't offer free services, even to neighbors. Thanks for understanding. Karen replied within 30 seconds, spoken like someone who doesn't understand what community means, disappointed but not surprised. I closed the app and threw my phone on the couch. This was ridiculous. I'd lived in Riverside Meadows for 5 years without any major issues. I paid my HOA dues on time, kept my lawn maintained, didn't throw loud parties or park junk cars in my yard. But apparently, not volunteering my labor and equipment for free made me public enemy number 1. The next few days were tense. I'd see Karen or one of her bored cronies around the neighborhood, and they'd make a point of looking away or whispering to whoever they were with. Someone left a passive-aggressive note on my truck windshield that said, "Nice to have neighbors we can count on," with the word count underlined 3 times. The Facebook group continued to be a battleground, with Karen making vague posts about entitlement and selfishness, clearly directed at me. Then, about a week after our initial confrontation, I received an official letter from the Riverside Meadows HOA. The envelope was thick, the kind that means someone spent way too much time on something petty. Inside were 3 separate violation notices. The first cited my truck for being commercial equipment that wasn't allowed to be parked in residential driveways overnight per HOA bylaws section 7.3.2. The second cited the landscaping supplies I stored on the side of my house, behind a privacy fence where you couldn't even see them from the street, for violating section 4.1.5 regarding external storage of business materials. The third, and this one made me laugh, cited my mailbox for being the wrong shade of black and not matching the approved color palette in section 2.8.1. Each violation came with a fine of $100 per day until corrected, and a demand that I appear before the HOA board at their next meeting to discuss my pattern of disregard for community standards. I called my lawyer, Steve Harrison, a friend from college who specialized in property law. After I read him the violations, he was quiet for a moment before bursting out laughing. "Xavier, this is the most transparent retaliation I've ever seen. They're mad you wouldn't plow their driveways, so they're hitting you with every petty violation they can think of. The mailbox thing is especially ridiculous. Do you have photos of your neighbors' mailboxes?" "Yeah, I can take some." "Why?" "Because I guarantee half of them are different shades of black, and nobody's getting violation notices except you. This is selective enforcement, which violates the HOA's own bylaws about fair and uniform application of rules. Don't pay these fines. We'll fight them." The HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at 7. The meetings were held in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that mostly got used for yoga classes and kids' birthday parties. I showed up 15 minutes early with Steve, both of us carrying folders full of documentation. The board sat at a long table at the front of the room, Karen in the center, looking like she was presiding over a Senate hearing, with Deborah Chen and Patricia Donovan on either side. Deborah was a thin woman in her 50s who ran some kind of consulting business from home, always talking loudly on her phone about synergy and paradigm shifts. Patricia was younger, maybe early 40s, a stay-at-home mom with 3 kids who seemed to derive all her purpose from HOA drama. About 20 other homeowners were scattered in the audience, some there for their own business, others clearly just for the entertainment. Karen banged a gavel that seemed unnecessarily large. "This meeting of the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association is now in session. First order of business, the multiple violations filed against Xavier Ingram of 247 Willow Court." I stood up. "Before we get started, this is my attorney, Steve Harrison. He'll be representing me regarding these violations." Karen's expression tightened. "This is a simple HOA meeting, Xavier." "There's no need for lawyers." Steve smiled politely. "My client has received violation notices that could result in thousands of dollars in fines. He has every right to legal representation, unless you'd like to dismiss the violations now." Patricia leaned forward. "The violations are legitimate concerns about community standards. This has nothing to do with any previous disagreements." "Right," I said. "It's just a coincidence that I've lived here for 5 years without a single violation, but within a week of declining to provide free plowing services to board members, I suddenly have 3 violations, including one about my mailbox being the wrong shade of black." Someone in the audience laughed. Karen shot them a look that could have frozen water. "Your truck is clearly commercial equipment," Deborah said, reading from a paper. "Section 7.3.2 states that commercial vehicles over a certain size cannot be parked in residential driveways overnight." Steve pulled out a document. "Section 7.3.2 specifically refers to commercial vehicles over 12,000 pounds or vehicles with commercial signage larger than 12 inches. Mr. Ingram's truck is a standard F250, well under the weight limit, and his business magnet on the door is 8 inches. He's in full compliance." Deborah's mouth opened and closed. Patricia jumped in. "What about the storage of business materials? That's clearly not allowed." "The supplies are stored behind a privacy fence, completely out of view from the street or neighboring properties," Steve said. Section 4.1.5 prohibits visible storage of business materials that create an eyesore. Since the materials aren't visible, there's no violation. Also, I have photos of at least 6 other properties in Riverside Meadows that have similar or worse storage situations, none of which have received violations. That's selective enforcement." Karen's face was getting redder. "The mailbox is definitely not the approved color." We have strict standards about community aesthetics. I pulled out my phone and opened a photo album. I took pictures of every mailbox on my street this morning. Here's number 243, clearly more blue-black than true black. Here's 251, which is actually dark gray. Here's 239, which has a decorative wreath on it that's definitely not in the approved specifications. None of those homeowners have received violations. Just me. This is absurd, Karen snapped. We don't have time to police every minor variation in the neighborhood. We focus on the most egregious violations. So you admit that my mailbox is a minor variation, not an actual violation worth $100 per day fine? Steve asked. The room had gone quiet. Several people were holding up their phones, clearly recording. I saw Tom Richardson in the back row, grinning. Karen stood up. I think we need to table this discussion and reconvene when we've had time to review the relevant bylaws more carefully. Or you could just dismiss the violations now and admit this is retaliation for Xavier not providing free services, Steve said. His voice was still polite, but there was steel underneath. Patricia whispered something to Karen. They had a brief, hushed conference with Deborah before Karen sat back down. Fine. The violations will be dismissed pending further review. But let me be clear, Xavier. This board takes community standards seriously, and we will be watching for any actual violations. That's all we ask, Steve said. Fair and uniform enforcement of legitimate rules. The meeting moved on to other business, something about approving new landscaping for the common areas, but I wasn't really listening. I'd won this round, but I could feel the hostility radiating from the board table. Karen wasn't the type to let something go. This was just getting started. February brought more snow, 3 separate storms that kept me busy with my regular plowing clients. I made a point of driving through riverside meadows with my plow down, blades scraping the asphalt, every time I came home from a job. Karen's driveway remained unplowed except for the minimum her husband, Richard, managed with a snowblower. I'd see her struggling to navigate the icy ruts in her Lexus, and I'd wave cheerfully as I drove past. The Facebook group remained hostile territory. Karen continued her campaign of passive-aggressive posts about community spirit and helping neighbors. She organized a community care committee that was supposed to coordinate volunteers to help elderly or disabled residents with winter tasks. The whole thing was clearly designed to shame me, except that when people actually signed up to help, Karen found reasons why their assistance wasn't needed or wasn't the right kind of help. Then, in mid-February, another massive storm hit. The Weather Service was predicting 24 inches of snow, the worst storm in a decade. I spent the day before the storm hitting the hardware store for supplies and calling my regular clients to set up a plowing schedule. My phone was ringing constantly with new requests, including 3 from people in Riverside Meadows who weren't on the HOA board. The storm started around midnight and didn't let up for almost 36 hours. By the time it ended, Columbus looked like a Christmas card painted by someone who'd never heard of moderation. Snow was piled everywhere, roads were barely passable, and the city had declared a snow emergency. I started plowing at dawn the day after the storm ended. My regular commercial clients came first, the ones who'd had contracts with me all winter. Then the residential customers who'd called ahead. By the time I got to the 3 driveways in Riverside Meadows, it was early evening and I was running on coffee and spite. I just finished the 3rd driveway when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. Xavier Ingram. This is Margaret Sutherland from the Riverside Meadows HOA board. Margaret was one of the newer board members, someone I'd barely interacted with. She sounded nervous. "What can I do for you, Margaret?" "I'm calling on behalf of the board. Given the severity of this storm, we'd like to formally request your plowing services for several board member driveways and critical community areas. We understand you have a business to run, and we're prepared to compensate you fairly." I almost dropped my phone. "Really? What changed?" She hesitated. "Several board members are unable to get their cars out of their garages. Karen's husband fell on their driveway trying to shovel and hurt his back. Deborah has an important client meeting tomorrow that she can't miss. We need professional help. And my rate is $150 per driveway, $175 for driveways over a certain size or difficulty." "That seems reasonable. Can you start tonight?" I looked at my truck, at the salt streaks and the piece of plow blade I'd need to replace soon, and I thought about Karen's face when she'd threatened me back in January. "I can start tomorrow morning," I said. "I need to do some maintenance on my equipment tonight. Send me a list of addresses and I'll work up a quote." "Thank you so much, Xavier. I'll email you the details within the hour." She hung up, and I sat in my truck for a minute thinking. This felt like a trap. Karen didn't back down, didn't suddenly become reasonable. But Margaret had sounded genuinely desperate, and I had a business reputation to maintain. If I refused to help now, especially after they'd agreed to pay, I'd look like the petty one. The email came through at 8 p.m. 6 addresses. Karen's, Deborah's, Patricia's, Margaret's, and 2 other board members I barely knew, Susan Fletcher and Brenda Mitchell. All of them had long driveways, and Karen's had a complicated curve around some decorative landscaping that would be a pain to navigate. I calculated materials, time, and difficulty, and sent back a quote for $900 total. Margaret replied within 5 minutes. "Approved. Can you start at 7 a.m.? I was at Karen's house at 7 sharp the next morning. The sun was just coming up, turning the snow-covered development into something almost peaceful. Karen's driveway was a mess. Nearly 3 feet of snow mixed with the chunks her husband had managed to move before injuring himself. I backed my truck in, dropped the blade, and started plowing. It took about 20 minutes to get the main driveway clear, pushing the snow into neat banks on either side. Then I worked on the curved section near her landscaping, carefully avoiding her decorative brick border and the sad little evergreen shrubs buried in snow. I was just finishing up, spreading salt on the cleared pavement when Karen came out her front door. She was wearing a bathrobe and boots, her hair uncombed. "You're plowing now. After refusing to help when we actually needed you," I kept spreading salt. "Your board hired me. I sent a quote, it was approved, and here I am doing the work. This is ridiculous. $900 to plow a few driveways. You're gouging us. That's my standard rate. Actually, I'm undercharging for Karen given how complicated your driveway is. You've got that curve, the landscaping, the grade change. Most services would charge you $200 just for yours." She crossed her arms. "We shouldn't have to pay you at all. This is basic community support." I stopped spreading salt and looked at her. "Karen, you're not my family. You're not even really my friend. You're someone who lives in the same housing development as me and who has been trying to make my life difficult for the past 6 weeks. Why would I do free labor for you? Because that's what good neighbors do. Good neighbors don't threaten people with fake HOA violations when they don't get their way. Good neighbors don't run social media campaigns to turn the community against someone. Good neighbors treat each other with basic respect." Her face went through several interesting color changes. "You know what? I don't want you plowing my driveway. You're trespassing. Get off my property." I shrugged. "Fine with me. I'll adjust the invoice to remove your address and move on to the next house. You do that, and don't expect any favors from this board going forward." I climbed back in my truck and drove down to Deborah's house. She was much more pleasant, actually came out to thank me and offer me a bottle of water. Patricia wasn't home, but her husband Jim waved from the window. The other 3 driveways went smoothly. When I finished, I sent an updated invoice to Margaret for $725, noting that Karen had refused service. She replied with a question mark emoji, and then, "I'll handle it." I was home by noon, eating leftover pizza and watching a hockey game when someone knocked on my door. Through the window, I could see it was Karen, this time fully dressed and carrying a folder. I considered not answering, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. "What now?" I spoke with the rest of the board. "We've decided that your services are no longer needed. Margaret had no authority to hire you without a full board vote. Too late. The work is done. Not my driveway. I refuse service." And I adjusted the invoice accordingly. The other 5 board members got their driveways plowed, and they owe me $725. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that meant something bad was coming. "The board has voted not to pay your invoice. Since you were never officially approved as a vendor for the HOA, we have no obligation to compensate you." I felt my blood pressure spike. "Margaret hired me on behalf of the board. I have the emails." Margaret exceeded her authority. "The invoice is rejected." She pulled a paper from her folder and held it out. "This is official notice from the Riverside Meadows HOA board. Have a nice day, Xavier." She walked away before I could respond, leaving me holding a formal rejection letter on HOA letterhead. I stood in my doorway, reading the legal-sounding language that basically said they were refusing to pay because of a technicality about vendor approval processes. I called Steve immediately. "They're refusing to pay for work they hired me to do. Send me everything. The initial contact, the quote approval, the invoice, and this rejection letter. This is breach of contract. We'll file in small claims court." "How long will that take?" "Could be a couple months to get a hearing, but you'll win. This is pretty clear-cut." I spent the rest of the day documenting everything, screenshots of emails, photos of the plowed driveways with timestamps, even a statement from Deborah's husband who'd witnessed me doing the work. Steve filed the paperwork on Monday. Then I had an idea. A really petty idea that made me smile for the first time in days. Riverside Meadows had a set of community rules about snow removal. Individual homeowners were responsible for their own driveways, but the HOA was responsible for plowing the main roads through the development and the parking areas near the community center and pool. They'd hired some cheap service this year that did a mediocre job, usually showing up a day or two after storms and leaving huge piles of snow blocking mailboxes and partially covering driveways. What the rules didn't specify was where homeowners could put snow from their own driveways. Most people pushed it to the sides, creating banks along their property lines. But technically, the street was HOA property. And if I was careful about it, there was nothing stopping me from plowing my driveway directly into the street, adding to the mess their cheap service had to deal with. The next storm came in early March, about 8 inches of wet, heavy snow. I waited until the HOA's service had made their first pass through the neighborhood, clearing the streets to barely passable. Then I got my truck ready. Instead of pushing the snow from my driveway to the sides like normal, I angled my blade to push it straight out into Willow Court. I created a nice, compact pile of snow right in the middle of the street in front of my house. Then I went down to the end of the court and did the same thing for Tom Richardson, who'd asked me to plow his driveway and was absolutely delighted by my plan. By the time I was done, there were 3 strategic piles of snow partially blocking the street, not enough to make it impassable, but enough to be annoying. I was admiring my handiwork when Karen's Lexus came around the corner. She had to slow down to navigate around the snow piles, and I could see her face turning red even from a distance. She stopped her car, rolled down the window, and screamed at me. "What the hell do you think you're doing, plowing my driveway? Is there a problem? You can't dump snow in the street. That's HOA property." I pulled out my phone and opened the bylaws document. "Show me where it says that." Section 11.4 says homeowners are responsible for snow removal from their driveways and walkways. It doesn't specify where we're supposed to put the snow. Common sense says you don't block the street. I'm not blocking it. There's plenty of room to get by. You just did. She was so angry she was shaking. "This is vandalism. This is destruction of community property. I'm calling the police." "Go ahead." I'm happy to explain to them how I'm following the bylaws exactly as written. She rolled up her window and drove off, nearly hitting one of the snow piles in her rage. I went inside and waited. The police didn't show up, but I did get a cease and desist letter from the HOA's lawyer by the end of the week. It demanded I stop malicious dumping of snow on community property and threatened legal action if I continued. Steve read the letter and laughed so hard I thought he was going to hurt himself. "Xavier, this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen an HOA do, and I've seen some dumb HOAs. You're not violating any laws or bylaws. They'd have to actually update their rules to stop you, which requires a vote, which requires notice to all homeowners, which means everyone will know they're changing the rules specifically to target you. So I can keep doing it. I mean, you're being incredibly petty. But yes, legally there's nothing they can do." The next storm came a week later. This time, I didn't just do my driveway. Tom had spread the word, and I had 5 other homeowners on Willow Court who wanted me to plow their driveways and were happy to have me dump the snow in the street. I quoted them half my normal rate since I didn't have to be careful about where the snow went. By the time I finished, Willow Court looked like an obstacle course. Strategic piles of snow created a slalom run that made driving through our street an adventure. The HOA's cheap plow service showed up the next day, saw the mess, and apparently refused to clear it, claiming it was beyond their contract scope. Karen called an emergency HOA meeting. It was scheduled for Saturday morning, which seemed specifically designed to inconvenience people, but about 30 homeowners showed up, mostly to see the fireworks. Karen was vibrating with rage when she called the meeting to order. "We're here to address Xavier Ingram's continued sabotage of community snow removal efforts. His deliberate dumping of snow in the streets is creating hazardous conditions and violating the spirit of our community standards." I raised my hand. "The spirit, so not the actual written rules." "You know exactly what you're doing. This is harassment." Steve stood up. "My client is removing snow from private driveways and placing it on HOA property, which is the HOA's responsibility to manage according to your own bylaws. If you'd like to pay him the $725 you owe for the February plowing, plus late fees and legal costs, perhaps we could discuss his snow removal practices." Patricia jumped in. "That invoice was rejected. We don't owe him anything." "A judge will disagree." "We have a small claims hearing scheduled for April 15th. I'm very confident in our case." Someone in the audience, an older man I didn't know well, raised his hand. "I have a question. Why didn't the board just pay Xavier in the first place? It seems like this whole thing could have been avoided." Karen's face did that color-changing thing again. "The board was not properly consulted before Margaret hired him. It was a procedural issue." "So you're refusing to pay $700 over a procedural issue, And now you've probably spent more than that on lawyer fees for these letters." The old man shook his head. "I've been in this development for 12 years, and this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen the board do." Several people murmured agreement. I saw Tom in the back, filming on his phone. Deborah tried to regain control. "The point is, we need to update our bylaws to prevent homeowners from dumping snow in the streets." I motioned that we create a new rule requiring all snow removal to maintain clear access on community roads. "I second," Patricia said immediately. "Any discussion?" Karen asked, clearly hoping to rush this through. Steve raised his hand. "Bylaw changes require a 30-day notice period and a vote by all homeowners, not just the board. That's in your governing documents, Article 5, Section 2. Karen looked like she wanted to throw something at him. "Fine. We'll issue proper notice and hold a vote next month. In the meantime, Xavier, if you continue this behavior, we will find a way to hold you accountable." "Looking forward to it," I said. The meeting dissolved into chaos after that, with multiple people arguing about whether the snow piles were actually a problem or if the board was overreacting. I left feeling pretty good about the whole situation. Over the next few weeks, I continued my snow dumping campaign. Every time it snowed, I'd plow driveways for anyone on Willow Court who wanted it, creating impressive piles of snow in the street. The HOA's cheap plow service eventually refused to come to our street at all, which meant the only clear path was the one through my snow piles. Some of my neighbors loved it. Tom started calling me a resistance fighter and bought me a case of beer. Others complained to the board, but since the board had no legal way to stop me, there wasn't much they could do. The bylaw vote happened in mid-March. The proposed change would require all snow to be removed to private property only, not community roads. The vote needed a majority of homeowners to pass. It failed. 54% voted against it. I found out later that a bunch of homeowners were mad at the board for wasting time on petty fights instead of fixing actual problems, like the broken streetlight at the entrance that had been out for 6 months, or the pool heater that never worked right. My snow piles had become a symbol of frustration with the board's misplaced priorities. Karen was apoplectic. She posted a long rant in the Facebook group about how the community was descending into anarchy and how she was gravely disappointed in her fellow homeowners for not supporting basic order and decency. Several people replied suggesting she resign if she was that upset. Then came April and the small claims hearing. The courthouse in downtown Columbus was busy, filled with people arguing over security deposits, unpaid bills, and property disputes. Steve and I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, reviewing our documents. "This should be straightforward," Steve said. "You did the work, they hired you, they're refusing to pay over a bogus technicality. Judge will rule in your favor." Karen showed up with the HOA's lawyer, a tired-looking man in an expensive suit who clearly had better things to do. I watched them have what looked like an intense conversation near the water fountain. When our case was called, we filed into the courtroom. The judge was a woman in her 60s who looked like she'd heard every excuse in the book and wasn't interested in hearing them again. The HOA's lawyer made his case first. "Your Honor, the plaintiff was never properly approved as a vendor for the Riverside Meadows HOA. Miss Sutherland, who hired him, did not have the authority to make that decision without a full board vote. Therefore, there was no valid contract and no payment is owed." Steve presented our evidence. "Your Honor, we have emails showing Miss Sutherland identifying herself as calling on behalf of the HOA board. We have the plaintiff's quote, which was explicitly approved." We have photographic evidence of the completed work. Miss Sutherland's authority to act on behalf of the board is an internal HOA matter. From my client's perspective, he was hired by a board member, did the work as agreed, and deserves to be paid. The HOA cannot retroactively claim their own representative lacked authority after the work was completed. The judge looked at the emails, looked at the photos, and looked at Karen, who was sitting behind the HOA's lawyer with her arms crossed. "Mr. Ingram, explain to me the history of your relationship with the HOA board. The court filings suggest there's more context here." I explained the January incident, the free plowing demand, the retaliatory violations, and the Facebook campaign. The judge's expression grew increasingly annoyed. "So the board demanded free services you declined, they hit you with fake violations, then later hired you and are now refusing to pay. That's accurate, Your Honor." She turned to the HOA's lawyer. "Counsel, does your client understand that retaliation and bad faith are not going to help their case here?" The lawyer whispered with Karen for a moment. "Your Honor, the HOA maintains that the hiring was not properly authorized, and I maintain that's not the plaintiff's problem. He acted in good faith based on communications from someone identifying themselves as a board representative. Internal HOA politics don't negate a valid contract. Judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $725, plus court costs and reasonable attorney fees." "The defendant has 30 days to pay." Karen stood up. "This is outrageous. We're being punished for following our own procedures." The judge gave her a look that could have melted steel. "Madam, sit down. You hired someone to do work. They did the work. You owe them money. If you want to discipline your board member who hired them without proper authority, that's your internal matter. But you don't get to stiff a contractor over it. This hearing is concluded." We filed out of the courtroom. In the hallway, Karen tried to get in my face. "This isn't over. You think you've won, but you have no idea what's coming." Steve stepped between us. "Miss Pritchard, I strongly suggest you avoid making threats. My client has been remarkably patient with what amounts to ongoing harassment. If this continues, we'll be filing for a restraining order and potentially pursuing a harassment suit against you personally and the HOA." Her lawyer grabbed her arm. "Karen, stop talking. Now." They left and I turned to Steve. "Do you think she'll actually pay?" "She has to. If she doesn't, we go back to court and the judge adds more penalties. But honestly, Xavier, I think this might get worse before it gets better. She's not thinking rationally." He was right. The HOA did pay the judgment, but it took the full 30 days and came with a letter from their lawyer threatening legal action if I continued my harassment and interference with HOA operations. I responded with my own letter pointing out that plowing snow on public streets wasn't harassment, and that if they wanted me to stop, they should pay me not to plow or find a way to actually enforce their rules legally. Spring came eventually, the snow melted, and I thought maybe the whole thing would blow over. I was wrong. In May, I received a notice of a special assessment from the HOA. Every homeowner was being charged $500 to cover unexpected legal expenses and emergency snow removal costs incurred during the winter season. The notice didn't specifically mention me, but everyone knew what it was about. My phone started ringing with angry neighbors demanding to know why they were being charged extra because of my fight with the board. I called an impromptu meeting at Tom's house. About 15 homeowners showed up, all of them pissed off about the special assessment. "This is bullshit," said Mike Cordero. "Why are we paying for the board's legal fees because they refuse to pay you for work they hired you to do?" An older woman, Jennifer Walsh from Oak Lane, nodded. "I've been reading the bylaws. Special assessments are supposed to be for actual emergencies or necessary improvements. Legal fees from optional litigation don't qualify. So what do we do? Someone asked. Steve, who I'd invited to the meeting, cleared his throat. You can contest the special assessment. You'd need to call a homeowner vote to remove it. Or, alternatively, you could call a vote to remove the current board members and elect new ones. That got everyone's attention. Karen had been board president for 3 years, and her little clique had run the HOA like their personal fiefdom. A lot of people were sick of it, but no one had organized opposition before. I'll run for board president, Tom said. I'm retired, I have time, and I promise my main platform will be not being an absolute nightmare to deal with. I'll run for a board position, Jennifer added. I was on the board of my old HOA before we moved here. I actually know how these things are supposed to work. Over the next few weeks, we organized. The HOA bylaws required a petition signed by 20% of homeowners to call a special election. We needed 34 signatures. We got 67. Karen fought it every step of the way. She claimed the petition was invalid because of formatting issues. She said the bylaws required 90 days' notice for elections. She tried to schedule the vote for a Tuesday afternoon when most people would be at work. Steve shot down every objection with citations to the actual bylaws and Ohio HOA law. The vote was scheduled for a Saturday morning in June. The campaign was nasty. Karen's faction put out flyers calling Tom and Jennifer extremists who wanted to eliminate all community standards. They claimed I was secretly controlling the opposition candidates to take over the HOA for my personal benefit. One flyer actually suggested that if Tom won, I'd somehow force everyone to hire me for landscaping services. Our campaign was simpler. We pointed out the failed violation attempts, the refused payment, the special assessment for legal fees, and asked if people were happy with how the board had been running things. Election day had a huge turnout. The community center was packed with homeowners, many of whom I'd never seen at a meeting before. Karen looked confident, surrounded by her supporters. Patricia was running for re-election, as was Deborah. Susan Fletcher had declined to run again, apparently tired of the whole situation. The vote was by secret ballot. We had an independent third-party counting, a requirement Steve had insisted on to prevent any claims of fraud. It took 2 hours to count all the votes. When the results were announced, Tom had won with 62%. Jennifer won a board seat with 58%. 2 other neighborhood residents who'd run on the reform platform also won seats. Patricia kept her seat by a narrow margin. Deborah and Karen lost. Karen's face went through every stage of grief in about 10 seconds. She stood up, announced that the neighborhood was going to hell, and walked out. Several of her supporters followed. The new board had their first meeting a week later. Tom's first act as president was to rescind the special assessment. His second was to formally apologize to me on behalf of the HOA for the unprofessional conduct and harassment of the previous board. Xavier, the HOA treated you terribly. Speaking for this board, we're sorry. We're going to try to do better going forward. I appreciated it, but I also knew this wasn't completely over. Karen still lived in the neighborhood. She still had her supporters, and she'd made it clear she considered me her personal enemy. Summer was mostly quiet. I focused on my landscaping business, which was booming. Several of my neighbors hired me for yard work, and I picked up some new clients from surrounding developments. I even did some work for Tom, redesigning his backyard garden. Karen avoided me entirely, which was fine. I'd see her car around the neighborhood, and we'd pretend not to notice each other. Patricia remained on the board but kept a low profile, apparently having learned her lesson about petty feuds. Then, in late August, things got weird. I started noticing small acts of vandalism around my property. Someone spray painted a crude penis on my mailbox. My garbage cans were knocked over multiple times. Someone egged my truck. I installed security cameras and caught a teenager from the neighborhood, Derek Pritchard, Karen's 17-year-old son, throwing eggs at my house. The footage was clear, showing his face and everything. I called the non-emergency police line. The officer who showed up watched the video and sighed. "That's definitely Derek. Do you want to press charges?" I want him to stop, and I want his mother to know I have proof. The officer went to Karen's house. I watched from my window as she came to the door, talked to the officer, and then screamed for Derek. Even from a distance, I could hear her yelling. Derek came over 20 minutes later, his mother marching behind him. He knocked on my door with all the enthusiasm of someone heading to their execution. "I'm sorry for vandalizing your property," he mumbled. "It won't happen again." Karen stood behind him, arms crossed. "Are you satisfied? My son has apologized. I want to know why he did it in the first place." I've never had a problem with Derek. Derek looked at his mother, then at his feet. "Mom said you were ruining the neighborhood, that someone needed to teach you a lesson." Karen's face went pale. "I never said that. Derek is confused. He's been having some behavioral issues lately." The police officer who'd followed them over raised an eyebrow. "Madam, encouraging your minor child to commit vandalism is itself a crime. I'd suggest being very careful about what you say next." She grabbed Derek's arm. "We've apologized. We're done here." She dragged him back toward their house. The officer stayed behind. "Mr. Ingram, I'm going to file a report about this. If there's any more vandalism, call us immediately. And honestly, you might want to consider a restraining order. This woman seems unstable." I thought about it, but a restraining order felt like escalation I wasn't ready for yet. I just wanted to live my life without HOA drama. September brought a new problem. I received a notice that my business license application for my home office had been denied by the city. Apparently, someone had filed a complaint claiming I was running an illegal commercial operation from a residential property. I called the city planning office. The clerk explained that they'd received a detailed complaint with photos alleging that I was storing commercial equipment, operating a business with client meetings at my residence, and violating residential zoning. "Who filed the complaint?" I asked. "The complaint was anonymous, but it came through your homeowners association." Of course it did. I got Steve involved again, and we filed a response showing that my business was properly licensed, that I didn't have client meetings at my house, and that storing a work truck and basic equipment didn't violate any zoning laws. The city approved my license, but it was another hassle, another month of stress dealing with bureaucratic nonsense because Karen couldn't let go of her vendetta. Tom called me after he heard about it. "Xavier, this is getting out of hand." As HOA president, I can't stop her from filing complaints with the city, but I want you to know the board doesn't support this. We're looking into whether she's violated any bylaws by filing false complaints on behalf of the HOA when she's no longer on the board. I appreciate that, Tom. Honestly, I'm just tired. I've lived here 5 years and the last 9 months have been a nightmare because I wouldn't plow some driveways for free. I know, man. For what it's worth, most of the neighborhood is on your side. Karen's burned a lot of bridges, but I'd be careful. People this obsessed don't usually stop until something forces them to. He was right. In October, I received a lawsuit notice. Karen was suing me personally for harassment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit claimed that I had engaged in a systematic campaign to humiliate her, damage her reputation, and drive her from her home. The filing was 40 pages of creative fiction. She claimed I'd stalked her, made threatening comments, turned the neighborhood against her, and caused her severe emotional distress requiring therapy. She was seeking $50,000 in damages. Steve read the lawsuit and looked genuinely worried for the first time since this whole thing started. "Xavier, this is frivolous, but it's also going to be expensive to fight. Even with how ridiculous these claims are, you'll need to respond, and that means legal fees." "Can we countersue for frivolous litigation?" "Possibly, but that's more legal fees. Let me see if I can get this dismissed quickly. Most of her claims are clearly retaliatory and unsupported by evidence." The next few months were a blur of legal paperwork and stress. Steve filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that Karen's claims had no legal basis. We provided evidence showing that I'd never harassed her, that any damage to her reputation was self-inflicted based on her own behavior, and that the emotional distress claim was absurd. The hearing for the motion to dismiss was in January, almost exactly a year after this whole mess started. The judge was a different one this time, a younger man who looked bored by the whole thing until Steve started presenting evidence. Karen's lawyer tried to argue that the case should go forward, that there were genuine disputes of fact that needed to be resolved. But when the judge started asking specific questions about what harassment I'd supposedly committed, the whole case fell apart. "So, counselor, your client claims Mr. Ingram stalked her. Do you have any evidence of that? She saw him driving through the neighborhood repeatedly, Your Honor. He lives in the neighborhood, but his frequent presence caused her distress. Existing in one's own neighborhood is not stalking. What else?" It went on like that for 20 minutes. The judge grew increasingly irritated as it became clear that Karen's entire case was based on her being angry that I wouldn't do free work, and that the neighborhood had voted her out of the HOA board. Motion to dismiss is granted. Furthermore, I'm sanctioning the plaintiff for bringing a frivolous lawsuit. Miss Pritchard, you are ordered to pay Mr. Ingram's legal fees associated with this case. Counsel, your firm should be more careful about the cases you agree to take. Karen's lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. Karen herself burst into tears and had to be escorted from the courtroom by her husband. Steve and I walked out into the cold January air. "That's it," he said. "It's over. She can't appeal a dismissal like this, and with the sanctions, she's going to think twice before trying anything else." I wanted to feel relieved, but I just felt exhausted. What a waste of a year. Hey, you won, in court in the HOA in the neighborhood. Sometimes standing up for yourself is messy, but you did it right. The legal fees sanction came to $12,000, covering all of Steve's time dealing with the lawsuit. Karen had 30 days to pay. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and her husband had a massive fight about it, loud enough that neighbors called the police for a domestic disturbance check. In February, I got a check for $12,000 and a brief note. "Payment in full. May we never speak again." I was fine with that arrangement. Spring came, then summer. Karen kept to herself and I kept to myself. The new HOA board was functional and boring, exactly what an HOA should be. They fixed the streetlight, got a better pool heater, and hired a decent snow plow service for the next winter. I kept running my business, and life went back to normal. My driveway accumulated the usual landscaping equipment. My truck sat in the driveway with its plow attachment. Nobody filed complaints or sent threatening letters. One day in August, I was working in my yard when Tom came over with a couple of beers. We sat on my back deck, looking at the woods behind my property. "Karen's moving," he said. "I heard they bought a house in Upper Arlington. Bigger place, no HOA. Good for her. Hope she's happier there. She's telling people she's leaving because the neighborhood has declined in quality since she left the board. But everyone knows the truth." I took a sip of beer. "What's that?" "That she couldn't let go of a grudge over something stupid, and it cost her thousands of dollars, her position in the community, and ultimately her home. All because she couldn't handle someone saying no to her." We sat in silence for a minute. Then Tom raised his beer. "To standing your ground, even when it's hard." I clinked my bottle against his. "To reasonable neighbors and boring HOA boards. I'll drink to that." A month later, I watched the moving truck pull up to Karen's house. She directed the movers with the same aggressive energy she'd brought to HOA meetings, pointing and snapping orders. She never looked toward my house, and I didn't wave goodbye. The new neighbors who moved in were a young couple with a baby. They introduced themselves within a week, brought over cookies, and asked if I knew any good pediatricians in the area. They were normal, pleasant people who didn't care that I ran a business or had a truck in my driveway. The Facebook group for Riverside Meadows slowly became less toxic. People posted about lost pets and garage sales instead of neighborhood feuds. Tom's board sent out reasonable notices about community events. The pool opened on time with a functioning heater. Life became exactly what it should have been all along, boring and predictable in the best way. Sometimes when it snowed, I'd look at my plow and remember that winter. The satisfaction of pushing snow into neat piles in the street, the absurdity of the whole conflict, the stress of lawsuits and violations. It felt like something that happened to someone else, a story I could tell at parties about the time my HOA went to war over snow plowing. But mostly, I tried not to think about it. I'd learned something valuable, though. Standing up for yourself matters, even when it's hard, even when people try to make you the villain for having boundaries. I'd refused to do free labor for people who treated me like garbage, and I'd been punished for it in every petty way they could manage. But in the end, the truth came out. The neighborhood saw who was being reasonable and who was being vindictive. The courts agreed that I was right, and the people who tried to abuse their power lost it. There's probably a bigger lesson in there about HOAs and power and community. But honestly, I'm just happy to mow my lawn in peace and plow whatever driveways I want without someone sending me violation notices for having the wrong shade of black mailbox. Tom served 3 years as HOA president before stepping down and passing the role to Jennifer. Under their leadership, the board actually updated the bylaws to be clearer and more reasonable. They added specific language about vendor contracts and payment procedures. They created an appeals process for violations. They even put term limits on board positions to prevent anyone from becoming a petty tyrant again. I served on a couple of committees, nothing major, just helping review landscaping standards and snow removal policies. I made sure the new rules were fair and actually made sense. It was boring work, exactly what HOA governance should be. My business grew. I hired 2 employees and bought a second truck. We handled landscaping and snow removal for 3 different developments, plus dozens of residential and commercial clients. I moved my equipment storage to a small warehouse space I rented, not because the HOA made me, but because it made more sense for the business. Every winter, when the first big snow hits, I still think about that February morning when I plowed snow into the street just to make a point. It was petty and vindictive, and probably not the most mature way to handle the situation. But it was also deeply satisfying. A middle finger to people who thought they could push me around just because they had a little bit of neighborhood authority. And you know what? I'd do it again. Not because I enjoy conflict, but because sometimes you have to show bullies that you won't be bullied. Sometimes you have to stand up for the principle of the thing, even when it would be easier to just give in. The snow melts every spring, and every spring I'm reminded that grudges and feuds are temporary, but integrity lasts. Karen learned that lesson the hard way. She spent thousands of dollars, lost her social standing in the community, and ultimately had to move, all because she couldn't accept that someone had told her no. I learned something too. I learned that community isn't about forced volunteerism or abuse of petty power. Real community is people helping each other because they want to, because they respect each other, because it makes the place they live better for everyone. It's neighbors bringing cookies, not violation notices. It's reasonable requests, not demands backed by threats. Riverside Meadows became that kind of community, eventually. The kind of place where people actually like living, where the HOA exists to maintain common areas and property values, not to wage personal vendettas. The kind of place where someone can run a business out of their home and store a work truck in their driveway without being treated like a criminal. I still live here, probably will for a long time. My house value has gone up, the neighborhood is well maintained, and my neighbors are good people. The woods behind my property are peaceful. My lawn is green. My mailbox is whatever shade of black it happens to be, and nobody cares. And if it snows next winter, I'll plow my driveway to the side like a reasonable person. Not because some HOA rule requires it, but because that's the right thing to do. Because I'm not fighting a war anymore. Because I won and winners can afford to be gracious. But I'll keep that plow blade sharp, just in case. You never know when someone might need a reminder that boundaries matter, that respect goes both ways, and that trying to force someone to work for free is never going to end well for you. The whole experience taught me more about human nature than I ever wanted to know. How people with a little bit of power will abuse it if they think they can get away with it. How communities can enable bad behavior by staying silent. How standing up for yourself, even in small ways, can inspire others to do the same. It also taught me patience. The legal system moves slowly, but it does eventually work. Communities can change, but it takes effort and organization. And sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, but simply living well and letting karma do its work. Karen is in Upper Arlington now, probably finding new battles to fight, new neighbors to clash with. Her husband Richard stayed silent through most of our conflict, but I heard he put his foot down about moving, refusing to stay in a neighborhood where his wife had burned every bridge. I don't know if they're happy, and honestly, I don't care. They're not my problem anymore. Patricia is still on the HOA board, surprisingly. She voted with Tom and Jennifer on most issues and has been generally reasonable. She apologized to me once quietly at a neighborhood barbecue. Said she'd gotten caught up in Karen's crusade and regretted how things went. I appreciated the apology and left it at that. No point in holding grudges. Deborah moved away too, not because of the HOA drama, but because her consulting business took off and she bought a bigger house in Dublin. We weren't friends, but we weren't enemies either. She was just someone who went along with Karen because it was easier than standing up to her. The rest of the old board members faded into normal neighborhood life. Susan Fletcher still waves when she sees me. Brenda Mitchell hired me to do her landscaping last summer. Margaret Sutherland, the board member who'd hired me in the first place and inadvertently started the whole legal mess, sent me a bottle of whiskey after the lawsuit was dismissed. No note, just the whiskey, but I understood what it meant. An acknowledgement that she'd tried to do the right thing and it had blown up in everyone's faces. Life in Riverside Meadows goes on. Kids play in the streets. Dogs bark at the mail carrier. Someone's always renovating something, and the sound of lawnmowers and leaf blowers provides a suburban soundtrack from spring through fall. It's normal, boring, comfortable. And when winter comes and the snow starts falling, I'll hook up my plow and get to work. I'll clear driveways for paying customers, and I'll do it well because that's what professionals do. I'll charge fair rates and do quality work, and people will hire me because I'm good at what I do, not because some HOA board demanded it. The whole saga, from that first confrontation in January to the final lawsuit dismissal a year later, feels like ancient history now. But the lessons stick with me. Stand up for yourself. Don't let people abuse power. Community matters, but real community is built on mutual respect, not forced compliance. And sometimes when someone demands you work for free, the answer is a simple, firm, unapologetic no. That no cost me stress, time, money, and peace of mind. But it also earned me something more valuable, respect, not just from others, but from myself. I didn't back down. I didn't let bullies win. I fought the fight that needed fighting, even when it was exhausting and frustrating and felt endless. And in the end, I won. The snow melted, spring came, and life moved on. But I'll always remember that winter, the winter the HOA demanded I plow their driveways for free, and I plowed snow into the street and sent them a bill instead. It wasn't my finest moment, maybe, but it was definitely my most satisfying one.